us sit down because we have a guest here from the Emerald City, from Washington, D.C. Michael Cromartie has lived in Washington, D.C., as we were just saying, since before just about everyone in this room was born. He's been there for 33 years. The last 23 have been with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he is vice president. And he has also been, well, he is on and has been chairman of the
U.S. Commission.
The U.S. Commission on
International Religious Freedom.
The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And we'll talk about that a little bit, and what that is. And I'll try to make sure that I remember the name. He's also a graduate of Covenant College on Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, and I'm going to hold for a moment the thing that I'm most interested in asking about. Michael, for a year after college, was the mascot of the Philadelphia 76ers. But first, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay.
And then went to high school in Atlanta.
High school in Atlanta, and then college at Covenant.
College at Covenant, but before that I became a Christian through Young Life Ministry in Atlanta.
How?
By going to a Young Life camp in Colorado and hearing the gospel explained for the first time.
Okay.
I then went to college at Georgia State University in Atlanta. But you'd be interested to know this because I'm not sure you know it. I was also drafted. You all may have heard of a thing called the War in Vietnam.
Heard of it.
I was my draft number was low, and
What was it?
I don't remember. I repressed it, but it was very low, and I became extremely interested in the Christian pacifist tradition. And I was a young new Christian, and I, like most people my age at the time, didn't like the war in Vietnam, and so I became a Christian pacifist. And so I applied for what's called conscience objector status, and I became a conscience objector to the war in Vietnam. And when you become a conscience objector, you have to do 2 years alternative service to the Army. And so I ended up working in an intentional Christian commune in the Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina. And then it was from there that I went to an American Bree conference at Covenant. I heard Dr. Francis Schaeffer speak there, and I realized when I finished my 2 years alternative service, which I was just about to finish, I would go to Covenant.
And that year when you heard Francis Schaeffer was?
That would have been 73. Were you there?
No, but
a lot of people were there.
yeah, it's a different galaxy that Michael and I grew up in, particularly in connection with the Vietnam War and draft lottery. I mean, this was a dramatic evening, if you can imagine. This was in 1965, 69.
Yes.
I think when you had on college campuses enormous opposition to the Vietnam War, and all these folks listening in, radio stations broadcast the drawing of lottery numbers, kind of like Lotto or something you'd see, the New York Gaming Association or something. Except this was for us. This was seen as life or death.
All I know is I started from the top of the numbers and worked, because if you were a part of the first, I think it was first 100, then you were going to be drafted.
Right.
Yeah. So I started like at 365 and slowly kept looking for my birth date.
Oh, you didn't hear it live?
No, I read it in the paper.
You read it in the paper?
The next morning, and I'll never forget where I was going through hoping, but I think it was down in the 70s somewhere.
Okay.
I say all that just to say that it's interesting how your life experience can cause you to begin to think more intensely about something.
Yeah.
And I just read all this Christian pacifist literature and became convinced that no believer should ever be involved in any kind of use of force. Now, at that point, I had not heard of any alternative arguments. And in fact, it wasn't until I got away to Covenant College that I learned about the just war theory and about the Christian application of that, and how the majority of Christian thinkers throughout Christian history bought into the just war theory. And so it was like a revelation to me. And so I actually had a conversion away from Christian pacifism to just war theory. And And to this day, I'm utterly convinced that Christian tradition allows the state to use force in situations where, real harm is going to come to others. And so you use force as a last resort. But mind you, as a new Christian out of young life, I just thought, well, this seems obvious. I read the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm not going. It was interesting. My parents at the time were very bothered by my stance, but they also didn't want me to go to Vietnam. So it created some interesting dynamics at home.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. But then I worked. My job, when I don't want to dwell on this too long, but it's important. I had a job working in at Duke Medical Hospital in the psychiatric unit, and then I also had a job working in the neighborhood in a young life type of capacity to meet the kids in the neighborhood by going down every day and playing basketball with all the local young people. And we were in an African American community, and I was the only white guy on the court every day. And I learned later from the guys I became friends with, they thought either I was selling drugs or looking for people who were selling drugs. They thought I was a narc agent, and I was just trying to invite them to Young Life camps. So from there I went to Covenant.
And so those 2 years actually turned out to be a valuable experience.
Very important. It was there. Let me just say, we were talking about this some at dinner, that there was, growing out of the counterculture of the 60s, there was a lot of Christians who came through the Jesus movement who bought into a sort of simple lifestyle theology, which also called people to, as much as possible, live in community, live in Christian community. And so I lived in a, quote, Christian commune for 2 years. But what happened in a lot of those communities is they not only bought into the very liberal and progressive politics of the late 60s, but they also bought into the theology and religious beliefs of people in the late 60s and early 70s. By that I mean the liberal theology of Rudolf Bultmann and Paul Tillich and others. And so all of my friends who'd been nurtured in their faith in young life were reading the most liberal theologians. And there I was, still with, I think, a very strong, sincere faith, being totally bombarded with these arguments. And the thing that really saved me was reading The God Who Is There and Escape from Reason. Francis Schaeffer is a man that you'll no doubt hear about while you're here at King's College, but he did a very, very good job of cutting through the deficiencies of those theologies, and it kept me on my path, and so then I ended up at Covenant because of that.
Yeah, Francis Schaeffer, changed the lives of really thousands of people. And some of the students here may be a little bit familiar with him from their reading, and also because one of our professors, Udo Mittelman, is the head of the Francis Schaeffer Foundation, is actually Schaeffer's son-in-law. So there's that family connection as well as the theological connection. So, and it's interesting, those 2 years were valuable. One of the things we've been hearing throughout this year with a variety of senior fellows and talking about careers is how rarely anyone takes a straight path. There are always circuitous routes. There are things that you learn in places where you didn't expect to learn, where you didn't expect to go. And nevertheless, those have proved extremely valuable over the years. So just a thing to remember as you maybe zigzag through the next few years after you graduate.
Well, the other thing I'd simply add to that was that when I was at that Christian commune, my politics were very much on what would be called the evangelical left at the time. I was a very intense monthly reader of Sojourners Magazine, then called the Post-American, and went off to Covenant College with my theology very conservative, but my politics were very liberal. But just to tell you about the theology of our Christian commune, I'll never forget at a night we had a big common meal together, and we went around the room, and everybody was supposed to state, say in 25 words or less, what they believed doctrinally and theologically. And we went around the room, and everybody, had some of the most new agey answers. By the way, let me just say, for any of my friends who are in that commune who might be watching this video someday, we can continue the conversation. Right. But they got to me and I said, I believe in the Apostles' Creed, and I also believe that the only thing we have unity about in this room is that we're all going to vote for George McGovern. That's what we're committed to in 1972. That's our orthodoxy, is that we're all going to vote for most liberal Democratic candidate we've had in some time, but we don't agree on anything theologically, and we think that's just fine. So there was a politically enforced orthodoxy, but not a religious enforced orthodoxy.
And McGovern, without the charisma of Barack Obama, only got 40% of the vote.
But not only that, he only got 2 states.
Yeah,
South Dakota, Massachusetts, and District of Columbia. He got 3.
Did he get South Dakota? Did he win his own state?
He won his own state,
Okay.
and he won Massachusetts. So anyway, that gives you a little bit of background that I took with me to Covenant College. And my politics at Covenant remained pretty much the same.
So you remain theologically conservative,
But politically very liberal.
yeah.
And I saw it as my duty at Covenant to bring in outside speakers to stir things up.
Okay.
And so as president of the student body, I brought in,
Jim Wallace?
no, but someone that preceded him, John Alexander of The Other Side magazine.
Okay.
Brought in Tom Skinner, a former black evangelist from New York City. Brought in a man named Bill Milliken, who used to work for him like on the Lower East Side of New York, and brought in a much more moderate and very sensible man, John Perkins.
Yeah.
So I sort of saw my job as to help my fellow classmates to learn more about the broader world. Because Covenant College, you may not know, it's a wonderful school, but it's on top of a mountain called Lookout Mountain, Georgia, near Chattanooga. And we were a little sheltered. It wasn't downtown Manhattan. It was downtown Lookout Mountain.
The Civil War had a famous battle called the Battle Above the Clouds.
Exactly, and that's where it's located.
Yeah, and sometimes the theorizing was above the clouds.
Always. And so my task, I thought, is with a little tiny budget with the student body, was to bring in outside speakers who could tell us about the rest of the world.
Okay. And so you graduated from Covenant with a degree in
Psychology.
psychology. Okay.
Here I've been involved in politics and social ethics for about 25 years. I had an undergrad in psych degree, so I don't know what that may say to some of you
Okay.
as far as your thoughts about your future major. But I left Covenant, came to
And you
Washington.
played basketball at Covenant.
Oh, did I? Yes.
You had your skills honed from your previous experience.
From my previous experience of
Yeah.
playing in an urban neighborhood for
Yeah.
2 years, every day. So
You could jump?
I couldn't jump, but I could shoot.
Okay.
I went from Covenant to Washington, and I spent 4 years working for a man named Charles W. Colson, who had just gotten out of prison for Watergate-related crimes, and started a prison ministry called Prison Fellowship. And Marvin, you'd find it interesting, when I joined Colson, again, I was theologically conservative, but politically very much to the left of center. And getting to know Chuck created some interesting dialogues, because he knew what he believed. But working together in prison ministry brought us both into the whole questions about social concern and social justice, and what does social justice mean, and what does it entail, and the role of the state. And just to cut to the chase, I was a social and political liberal until one evening I was bound and gagged and tied up in my hotel room in Denver, Colorado, literally mugged. And there's a great quote by a Jewish philosopher in Washington, Irving Kristol: "A neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality." Well, I was a liberal who had been mugged literally. And I've read social scientists who said, that sometimes, if you're a victim of crime, it does affect your view of crime and punishment. It did mine. It really wiped away some innocence and some views about crime. So you find your reading habits shift. You start reading different people. So you find out about who James Q. Wilson is, and you find out about Ernest von den Haag, and you find out about other views than the ones I'd been reading in Sojourner.
And this is while you were working for Chuck Colson.
I was working for Chuck, yes.
And
I was on the road with Chuck.
And you were working particularly in the prison ministry aspect? Or?
Absolutely. I traveled with Chuck all over the country. I've been in every prison in America with Chuck, because he was speaking in chapels at prisons around America with the prison ministry, and I was his research assistant and travel companion. And late one night in Denver, anyway, I won't give you the whole story, but I was bound and gagged and tied up in my hotel room, and thank God I wasn't harmed. But it affected, again, experience can shift your paradigm, and it affected my thinking.
So intellectually during this period, you were reading about crime,
Exactly.
Right? So,
And I was a total liberal, big-hearted goofball when it came to the reality of crime. It was all theory. And then when you become a victim, it just affects, your views of property and of stealing and of harming people. I could go on, but
so if students want to learn more about crime, I mean, you mentioned
Get
James.
mugged.
James get mugged. That's number one. And then number two, read James Q. Wilson, or
oh yes, well yeah, there's a lot of very good social scientists in that area. But all I'm saying is that I guess the point would be if we're conservatives and are thinking political, we ought to really read liberals, serious liberals. We ought to read the ones that, and when I say the word serious liberals, what I mean are liberals who are really open-minded, and there are those, who have come to their convictions through their own work, their own experience, and they're there. And I know these people, and I trust them. And we don't agree, but I trust their judgment. And I guess what I want to encourage here, instead of going out and getting mugged, we really got to try to understand why people hold the views they do, and really hear their arguments. And for me, it took certain experiences to cause me to think that way. Whether it meant working in an inner city neighborhood, or getting mugged, or traveling in prisons, and it took experiences for me. But now I think we can self-consciously, without having those experiences, say to ourselves, let me hear the counter-arguments to that. And trust that our opponents, even on some of these views, are, largely their intentions are pretty good.
4 years with Colson, and what comes next?
Then graduate school at American University in Washington,
Okay.
where I studied political philosophy and criminal justice, actually. And
Now, if you had gone to graduate school right after college,
I'd probably gotten a master's in counseling.
okay, and you would have missed.
I would have missed the opportunity to come to King's College and speak.
Okay, after you get your graduate degree, then
I then was working in Washington and had an interview with the Ethics and Public Policy Center in 1985, where I went to a dinner to hear a friend speak that the center hosted. And I met the founder of the center, Ernest Lefevre, and I said, "Sir, how are things going?" He said, "We're looking for 2 people." I mean, these are the first words out of his mouth. And I was, by the way, on a job search at that time. Had been on a serious job search. And he said, "We're looking for 2 people, Director of Development and Director of Protestant Studies." And I said, "Well," and by the way, the think tank I work for is one of the original think tanks in Washington that took seriously the relationship between religion and public policy. And when it was founded in 1976, its goal was, because religion was getting so much press, so much attention, that it seemed that there needed to be a think tank that explained religious bodies and critiqued religious bodies and their views on politics. And the founder was a man who wrote several books critiquing the National Council of Churches' view of foreign policy and the World Council of Churches. And he decided, he said, "We need a director of Protestant Studies." And I said, "Is a PhD required?" He said, "Well, no, not necessarily. The person has to know theology, know politics, and preferably be an evangelical Christian." I said, "Well, I can do that." Anyway, I had the interview, which lasted 4 hours, where I was quizzed on everything I'd ever read. What was I reading now? What magazines did I read? What books have I read? What are your views of this, that, and the other? It was really quite a fun exercise. I've been there since '85, and I've been the evangelical studies guy at EPPC since then.
So what's the weirdest thing that's happened to you on your job during that time?
That's a great question, and I think you should let me think about it, and it'll come out. A lot of interesting things have happened. Is weird the word you want?
Weird, exciting,
Interesting. Okay.
interesting. Weird is probably the shortest of those words. So, well, I think.
Let me think about it.
Yeah, I think about the. There are a lot of things I could ask about here, but I'm going to let the students get into questioning a little bit. But okay, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Tell us what that's about. And
The commission was founded by an act of Congress in 1998. The commission is called the United States Commission on National Religious Freedom. The purpose of the commission was to monitor religious persecution and religious torture around the world, and the lack of respect for religious liberty around the world, and to write up a report for Congress and for the White House and for the State Department detailing those countries that are the greatest violators of religious freedom and religious liberty on the globe. And every year we come out with an annual report that we send to the White House and to Congress and the State Department. But we also issue press releases and studies on, what status religious freedom is in North Korea, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Sudan. And the commission has been around for 10 years, and I was asked 4.5, almost 5 years ago, by the White House, by President Bush's office, to be on the commission. And I've been on it ever since. And the commission is made of 9 commissioners. It's bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans. Depending on who's in power, since President Bush has been in power for the last 6 years, there's been 5 Republicans, 4 Democrats. That'll now change with President Obama. And there'll be 4 of us Republicans and 5 Democrats. And we meet once a month to talk about, there's a very able staff of 20 people who are experts in different regions of the world, and they'll give us reports, and we will talk about what to say about these countries that our biggest responsibility really is to designate countries what are called CPCs, countries of particular concern. Now, when I first got on the commission, I thought, well, why does it matter to call a country a CPC? Well, I came to find out it matters a lot to those countries. They don't like being called countries of particular concern. It's not good for their PR. Their embassies are very concerned about it. And so we discussed which countries should be on that list. And I'll never forget when I was chair of the commission, we were leaving Bangladesh, and one of the leaders was saying goodbye to me. I was getting off the elevator. He said, when I'm in Washington next, we need to have dinner. I said, well, sure. He said, and by the way, take us off that damn list. I said, we'll check on it. And we didn't. But it meant something to him that it has some resonance in the diplomatic community that you should not be on the CPC list of U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So that's some of what we do. And we have a website. Just type in U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and you'll find out who we are. But let me just say, Marvin, it's been a wonderful experience to serve in that position, because one of the things, it's going to sound like a cliche, but I've been to 16 countries since I've been in that position. Every time I come back, I say to my wife, we really take a lot for granted here. And I've even said to her, don't talk to me anymore, anybody on the Christian right, about Christmas wars. I can't say Merry Christmas. Yes, you can. But there are people in other countries who do the slightest thing that we take for granted, like hand out leaflets, and they're in prison for 5 years. I mean, these states are so repressive, and they so fear religious believers because they know we answer to a higher authority, that they feel threatened by religious believers. And so, we were in Turkmenistan, and a Pentecostal pastor said, we know you've been meeting with government leaders this week. Thank you for coming to meet with us. We've had a house church. They won't give us the zoning to build a church. So we've been meeting in my house. But 2 weeks ago, they kicked me out of my house. And they sold my house because we were worshiping in my home. And I was quite moved by that. We take a lot for granted here. And we have some wonderful freedoms and liberties here that, in the midst of all our debates about the First Amendment, we should remember we're allowed to have debates about the First Amendment in this country. A lot of countries are not allowed to even have a public argument.
During the period of time we've been on the commission, have things improved in any of these countries?
Not really, but a few. Okay, I was too fast. Vietnam has improved. The government of Vietnam has opened up economically, and they're trying to open up religiously, and we're going to go back to Vietnam in 3 weeks. But it's hard for totalitarian and communist regimes to understand what religious freedom really means. They think it means we let them sing, we let them have Bibles, but they don't let them grow. They don't let them proselytize. They don't let them speak about it external to their own meeting place. And so you spend a lot of time talking about what religious freedom means and what rights are entailed by having the right of being able to speak freely. So Vietnam is improving. Saudi Arabia is a horrible place. But because of pressure from the State Department and our commission, they are trying to reform their textbooks. They're very slow. They have some awful things written in their textbooks about us and about Jews. Just hideous. And they've got a lot of pressure on them to change the language of their textbooks. And so you can see where we pushed, and you sort of use your press releases and your reports to shame these people through the press. And no, Saudi Arabia is not reformed, but it's hearing that what it's doing in exporting its doctrines of hate, it's not appreciated. And so they say they're reforming their textbooks. We're going to hold their feet to the fire. North Korea is still the worst country in all the world. Sudan is a really sad situation. But I would just simply say that it's important that one of the things that's important about the State Department office and the Commission is that we keep a searchlight on these places so they don't have any excuse anymore. They're not allowed to do this. And when we come to their country, they say, well, why do you think, as Americans, you can come tell us what we should believe? And we say, well, we are a U.S. commission, but we're actually aware of the fact that you've signed on to UN documents and to international covenants. Since you've signed on to them, we're calling you to account for that. That's why we're here. Live up to what you've signed up to. So that's some of the stuff we run into. It's been fascinating, as you can imagine. Yeah. The most moving thing is to meet religious believers in these countries, and we always make sure that we do, and to find out what they have to put up with, and what they've suffered. And well, I've already said it. We take a lot for granted.
Yeah. Third of a century in Washington. Watching evangelicals said, I'll mention a third of a century a few more times. What's changes during that period? I mean, you've seen the rise and fall of the moral majority, the rise and fall of the Christian coalition. I
feel like I'm 90. But you're right. No, you're right. That's exactly right. Keep going.
Yeah,
moral majority, Christian coalition.
What else? I mean, the rapid rise and quick demise of the Pat Robertson candidacy. In a sense, the Mike Huckabee candidacy, and so forth. So a lot of different things. Do you see the rise and demise of the Bush administration?
Yes. Well, let me say, in light of that, I have some lessons from that, and one of them would be that you all really do take a serious whole quarter and semester to read St. Augustine, and by that, what I mean to say that we do live between the city of God and the city of man. We live between the intersection of the ages. And so I would want to say, during the 80s, to my friends on the Christian right, you act as if Ronald Reagan is going to bring in the kingdom of God. He will not. And for those of you who've been disappointed by Mr. Reagan, why did you think he was going to do it anyway? You were overly utopian. And I was in the rooms in 1986 and 87 when people said, Reagan let us down. And I remind them, oh, did you want Walter Mondale to do it for us? I mean, Reagan might have let you down, but Mondale would have been our president in '84 if he'd have won. That wouldn't have been a good situation. So I'm because of readings of Augustine, I have a chastened view of politics, which is that we live in two kingdoms, and we live between the intersection of the ages. And during the intersection of the ages, our job is to work for approximate justice. Approximate justice. Reinhold Niebuhr once said that politics is the art of making choices between relative goods and lesser evils, and that we are to bring approximate justice to basically insoluble problems. That's Niebuhr, having read Augustine. And what he means by that is that because the world has fallen, because the world is decayed, because we live in a sinful world, we are never going to bring in any kind of utopia. And so that's a warning to people on the right and the left. And I want to come back to the Christian coalition and moral majority, but let me quickly jump forward to right now. I want to say that some of the fans of President Obama are going to make the same mistake that fans of Ronald Reagan and of George W. Bush made by expecting too much from him that he simply cannot deliver. I mean, Obama mania is worse than Reagan mania.
Yeah.
Obama mania is worse than any expectations any of us had for President Bush. And so the letdown is going to come. Why is it going to come? Because we live in a broken, fractious world. And politics, working for social justice, we work in an ambiguous world where our choices are never the choices we want, but they are the choices we have. And so I think the day will come when there'll be a lot of people on the left very disappointed with President Obama. Why? Because every day he has to read intelligence reports about the real threats that he knows that President Bush saw every day. So he may not please them. Now, we don't need to get into the Obama administration right now, but only to say that, yes, Marvin, I've been there a while, and I've seen Christians, I'm a person who encourages Christian civic duties and civic involvement in politics. At the same time, because of this understanding of Augustine, we must encourage it, we must do our duty while living in exile, but we must never have an overinflated view of politics. In other words, it's paradoxical.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, sure. And you know, we're talking about the past third of a century, but you know, the students here, I mean, some of them will be in Washington for a long time, and you will see this cycle occurring. In a sense, just as there are economic cycles, there are these political cycles, and each time, although I think you're right, this is the time we're seeing it more than any other time, at least in the past third of a century. But each time there's so much excitement at first, and so many utopian hopes. I mean, certainly it was there with Reagan. I saw it close up with the Republican Revolution in '94, and I was working with Newt in '95, and you know, this was like the French Revolution. You know, very blessed to be alive in those days. And again, the disappointment came very fast. Yeah.
But you saw, as I did, some people on the Christian right who got overly euphoric about these matters.
Absolutely.
I was in private meetings where I said, Reverend, did you just say that? Did you say what you just said after '94?
Yeah.
I'll try not to use his name. But I said, did you just say that an awakening, a spiritual awakening has occurred because of the 1994 election? Sir, you're more theologically orthodox than that, aren't you? This is a gentleman from California whose name will remain nameless. But I mean, he said that. And I said, please do not confuse a spiritual revival with a political election.
Right.
And he'd done it right there in the room. I'll never forget it at Heritage Foundation. And I was in the meeting, and I went to the meeting. I said, I'm not going to say anything. He was the first one up, and I said, did you just say that? You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And,
anyway, so let me just make this point, Marvin, about, if I could, Professor Olasky, Provost Olasky.
Yes, sir.
About the Augustine point. I had a teacher at Covenant College in Christian doctrine who used to talk about what he called the now but not yet. And he would draw up on the board, and maybe you do it here, you know, the intersection of the ages. And he'd keep reminding us, in between those ages is where we live. And for a lot of us, we want everything to be really clear cut. And he was saying, during the intersection of the ages, there's a lot of gray in here. Now that gray doesn't mean that we don't have convictions and we don't have positions. But it does mean that we shouldn't be surprised that the world has fallen and that there's a lot of misery and pain. Our job is to do our duty in our place of calling and to be faithful to that until the King returns.
Let's have some questions from you all.
Yeah, I'm about to start preaching. So.
David?
I learned a lot from Father Richard John Newhouse, and I'm sure you're familiar with him. And I really admire the way that he, first got from John Paul II, but he said that we as the church, we should propose, not impose.
Did you write that piece in the school newspaper?
I'm sorry?
Did you write the piece in the school newspaper
Yes.
that I just read?
Yeah.
Congratulations. I just read it about 2 hours ago.
Do you think there's, and the whole thing that you have doing at first stage, this interreligious dialogue where there's this rich argument, there's genuine argument within, but there's a certain civility about it.
Yes.
And there's an openness to other traditions as well, but there's a rigorousness of thought about it. Do you think that there's something similar in evangelical circles? on that scale out there right now.
Like First Things?
Right, but that kind of that sees our job as to propose, not impose. Because I mean, I don't know. I guess I still think of Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson as being, and I know that they're not as well respected anymore, but I don't know. I can't think of one particular figure, that's kind of claimed the mantle and really helped evangelicals to think about this.
Well, those are very good. Thank you. And let me just say that the first book I edited, Ethics and Public Policy Center, I co-edited with Richard John Newhouse, called Piety and Politics, Evangelicals and Fundamentalists Confront the World. Not in print, but I'm sure you can get it at Amazon.com. It's actually an anthology of 26 essays of evangelicals, right, left, and center. And if you look at Time.com, a couple of weeks ago, they asked me to do a 250-word appreciation for Father Newhouse. By the way, a man you cannot really be summarized in 250 words, but I tried. And I knew him well, and I came up for the funeral, and he's a mentor to me in many ways. And I've been a reader of First Things since the very first issue, so I know what you're talking about. The problem that you present is partly a problem of modern evangelicalism. Modern evangelicalism is not a monolithic church. The definition of evangelical is a word that defines people who are part of multi-denominations across the scope. So it's hard to say who speaks for evangelicals. The disadvantage we've had is that the evangelicals who make the oddest and wackiest comments are the ones the media want to highlight. And they go to them and say that again? And then they say it, and then 3 days later they say, well, I was taken out of context. It was one of those people that I used to defend in the press just because I thought they were picking on him, namely Pat Robertson. But I stopped that some years ago because some of the comments just got so ridiculously theologically wacky. I mean, post 9/11, some of the things he said post 9/11 I thought was not only inappropriate at the time, but theologically off course. And so I talked to the press a lot, and I said those things. Which is why, Marvin, I was surprised that you and I were both on a panel together at Regent University about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. The guy invited me. I said, did you not Google me? See what I said about the chancellor? He said, he doesn't have anything to do with this conference. But anyway, no, I think that what you're going to see is that the press will try to put the attention on a person or two that they'll say now speaks for evangelicalism, and that's what they're doing now with Rick Warren. And remember, Rick Warren's a pastor. He's not a public theologian. And he's trying to navigate this as well as he can, but he's really a pastor with a huge heart. So I hope that they don't try to get him to start holding forth on all manner of issues. And I hope he, in fact, resists that because that's not his vocation. Now, who will be the next? It's hard to say, but I think in the days ahead, in the next 4 to 8 years, new evangelical leadership will emerge and new spokespersons that will all, whose work we'll read. Some people used to go to Chuck Colson for those things, but whose work we'll read. But I think that more and more what's going to happen with evangelicals is we're going to just stop saying so-and-so speaks for me, and we're going to say Augustine speaks for me, or Calvin speaks for me, or Luther speaks for me on that matter. We'll point back to classical figures and say, if you want to understand where I'm coming from, go read Augustine. Say that to a reporter sometime. I have. It's pretty funny. Well, one reporter called me up once and said, it was when the Southern Baptists were debating about 8 years ago, not debating, making clear their view of male headship in marriage. And at their convention, they wanted to explain Ephesians to the world and to men and women about the relationship between men and women in marriage. And a New York Times reporter called me up and said, you've probably been following the Southern Baptist Convention and this whole debate about male headship. Well, what is this all about? And I said, well, let me see. Let me put it this way with you. In the book of Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 20, she said, hold, wait a minute. What book was that? Who's the author? Who's the publisher? I said, well, the author is a man named Apostle Paul. The book is Ephesians, and it's a New Testament letter. And she really had no idea. No clue. And she said, oh, you mean it's in the New Testament? I said, right. I said, now back to the point. They take, the passage is taken seriously, and this is how they read this. I was trying to explain it. And in my position at the center, I'm able to, oftentimes called to exculpate the world of modern American evangelicalism, which is a lot of fun, because you get to punch a lot of preconceived notions. But no, I think that we're just going to have to identify ourselves with a tradition that goes back not only to the Bible, but to a traditional way of understanding our tradition, and do it that way, instead of saying, well, I'm not going to vote until World Magazine tells me what to do, or until I read an editorial on Christianity Today, or what First Thing says. No, we're going to have to say, I read all these journals, but at the end of the day, I think I fit in this tradition. I think that might be the way. At least that's what helps me.
Let me ask a question about that. Who designates the spokesman for evangelicalism? And the same, this always used to come up with Jesse Jackson, when he was basically identified by the press as the spokesman for blacks. And there was a lot of resentment in that black community. Well, who designated him? Who made that choice? Same thing now. I mean, who chooses? Because I think you're absolutely right. The choice was often, well, Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, because they would say things that would fit right into the stereotypes and help to advance and continue those stereotypes.
I don't think there's a meeting at Newsweek or Time or NBC that says, let's go. But here's how to do it. Here's how you do it. You say that James Dobson has a radio program, does he? Oh, yes. Well, it's listened to by 20 million people. That might be important. So they call Dr. Dobson's offices because he really has a following. They do it with Rick Warren now. Why? Not only is he doing important work in Africa, but his book did sell more than any nonfiction book in the history of American publishing. He does have a church with 25,000 members. By the way, I'll be glad to say this on the record, I always have fun with the press when they call me and say, now, Rick Warren said this, and Jim Wallace of Soder said that. And I thought, wait, let me just correct one point here. Jim doesn't have a church. Jim has a magazine. Rick has a church with 25,000 members, and his book sold 25 million. So these are not sort of the same levels of influence here. No offense to Jim, but they're not morally equivalent as far as spokespersons for modern evangelicalism. And by the way, we can get into this as we go about the role of American evangelical left and evangelical progressives, highly overhyped and overinflated by the press right now in this current. You look at any of the poll numbers from Pew Forum, I mean, it is a vocal movement, it's a serious movement, and it's a very small movement. I can defend it with the data. No offense to my friends on the left, but you know the data. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question. And the young lady next to you had her hand up.
Actually, I was going to ask about Jim Wallace and the progressive movement, and especially this, movement, I think it's called the Third Way, I'm trying to remember, where they're building this coalition of moderates and liberals and conservatives to find consensus on issues like abortion and homosexuality and healthcare. So what's your sense of, you explained the left, but maybe also these coalitions that are trying to unite people to figure out what we can agree on?
Yeah, well, good luck. Good luck. I get real nervous when people use the word third way. There is no third way. In a modern election, you got two choices. And this language of the third way has been going around for about 30 years now, and I hate to bring the news. There are two people on the ticket, and we're not always happy with the two. But when you start talking about what are the cabinet appointments going to look like, what are the Supreme Court appointments going to look like, what are the defense secretaries going to look like, you go through the list, you say, yeah, they're going to be different. What might they do with certain laws and stuff? And then our friends come in the third way, and they say, well, we have a third way. But it's not on a ballot anywhere. And so I'm responding, first of all, to the language of the third way. Oftentimes when somebody says, you'll hear this language, we're neither right nor left, we're biblical. And then you ask them what their views are. And I say, that has a name. It's called liberal. And you think you're being sneaky by saying, I'm not conservative or liberal, I'm biblical. And oftentimes people do this. You know, I'm not a conservative or a Democrat. I'm not a liberal or conservative, Republican, Democrat. I'm distinctively third way. And then you go through the issues that you just named, and you say, well, what's your views on same-sex marriage? I mean, what are your views on abortion? What are your views on these? And, you know, then you end up finding out, well, they can be labeled. Now, that's my cryptic negative answer. My positive answer would be I'm all for people getting together and dialoguing and talking and trying to build coalitions. But you cannot have an honest coalition until you have an honest conversation. And if we're going to use these terms and shade issues that are really important, then we're not being honest. And I want to say that when I read that, you know, I look at the people and I know what their positions have been in the past, and I say, you know, are you going to vote for or against same-sex marriage? And they're going to say, well, yeah, but we've been beating up on gays and we need to stop. Yeah, I agree. All people made in the image of God, everybody ought to be treated with respect and dignity no matter what their struggles or persons are. I mean, I agree with that. But what are you going to do about the definition of marriage? You know, in some parties in this country, what you're going to do about that is not going to be allowed. You know, they will soon come in the Democratic Party. It's right now against same-sex marriage, but the pressure is huge for them to change that. Just look at the outcry to Rick Warren's inaugural prayer. I mean, the left went crazy on that. And it really surprised the Obama campaign, I think.
The left went crazy, not because of the content of the prayer, but because Rick Warren had been...
Was going to be the one delivering.
Right.
Because he supported Proposition 8 in California.
Proposition 8 was the proposition?
The proposition to legalize the traditional understanding of marriage. Is that right? And now, I'm sorry, did I get at some of what you're asking? I don't...
Well,
I'm not intentionally trying to step on anybody's toes, but
yeah.
I follow this, and when I hear these people are going to come in with a new solution, I just wish people say, look, I'm a liberal and I'm a Christian. Now let's talk. Or I'm a conservative and I'm a Christian. Let's have a dialogue about welfare reform. Or I'm a Christian and a liberal, and what are we doing in Iraq? Let's talk about it. But to say, you know, I'm really different. I'm not any of these things. It kind of, there's something a little bit, there's a little false advertising in it. That's all I'm saying. So I just say, slightly beware. That's all. Are you with me on that?
I'm with you on that. Now, I think there's a methodology, or maybe even a style of approach to this.
Yeah.
If you look at in our friend, esteemed Pastor Tim Keller,
Yes.
has been was preaching last summer about the parable of the prodigal son.
Yes.
And pointing out that in the parable of the prodigal son, certainly the prodigal has a problem, but he comes back and seems reconciled with the father. The elder brother has an even bigger problem.
Yes.
And when that parable ends, he's not reconciled with the father, it's left hanging.
Yeah.
So I think you can say that the younger brother has a problem, the elder brother has a spiritual problem also,
Yeah.
and that there is a need really there for a third brother. In the same way that Jesus is neither younger brother nor elder brother. So for example, I think you can say that in some ways, at least in American politics, the Democratic Party is often seen like a younger brother party, at least as far as on social issues, kind of a libertine party in that sense. Mm-hmm. And the Republican Party has seemed like an elder brother party. So, you know, sort of pointing finger and saying,
Yeah.
you know, and if you look at, this is going back 10 years to Bill Clinton, I mean, he was certainly a younger brother, a prodigal in certain ways.
Yeah.
And Ken, who's the prosecutor?
Ken Starr.
Ken Starr.
Yep.
I mean, Ken Starr certainly came across, or was depicted in the press as an elder brother, and most Americans, given that choice, actually more of them went with Clinton than with Ken Starr. So I think you can see a problem if, in some ways, we let ourselves get painted as an elder brother. This is evangelical Christians get painted as an elder brother who's pointing the finger at others without acknowledging that there's lots of sin within ourselves.
Look, I want to argue strongly, first of all, for anything I've said. Those of you who don't know me, I really believe in epistemological modesty and in Christian modesty. I think in all these things, I mean, let me just say this, urgently say this to you, although I don't have to say it to people who live in the middle of Manhattan. But, you know, it's really incumbent upon all of us to really develop friendships across all these, and I mean real friendships, not phony ones.
Yeah.
I mean, not, will you be my liberal friend so I can tell people I have one? But I mean real friendships. because we can really grow and learn from that. And too often, when I move in the circles of the Christian right, these people have never met anybody outside of the room they've been in for 30 years. And it's really unfortunate for them. And I've been in meetings with the Christian left where they think conservative evangelicals politically are all just racist bigots. And you want to say, you need to get out more. This is not the motivation. And so it's really incumbent upon us in our own, not only desire to grow educationally, but also spiritually. I think it's obligatory for us to get to know others. I want to say strongly that I'm a person, going back to some of the lessons I've learned, Marvin, from my quarter of a century, is that I really strongly believe in the gospel is more important than anything we're talking about right now. And I want to underline that because I have seen people so politicize the Christian faith that they break fellowship with friends over political differences.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong. I think that we are saved by the message of the gospel and the saving grace of Christ, not by our political convictions. And if we make political orthodoxy, either of the kind on the left or on the right, the reason why we have fellowship with others, then we are really being theologically wrong-headed. And I've seen this happen very much on the progressive side of the liberal wing, where liberation theologians used to say, if you didn't sign onto their Damascus Road declaration about the real state of the war in Latin America, then you weren't a believer, period. But then you come along, you see some Christians sometimes on the right that'll draw up certain criteria and say, I don't think Senator so-and-so is a believer. And I'll say, well, why do you say that? Well, because of his views on the war in Central America. Well, you know, you can be wrong politically and still redeemed. And I just think it's really important for us to remember that, because it's very easy in the political world to get so caught up in our latest passions that we forget there are some things that transcend politics. Again, an Augustinian point.
Yeah. So you're functioning in a sense as a third brother, but it's not the same as a third way or
Right.
anything like that.
Yes, I thank
Yeah.
you for pulling that out, and I do want to emphasize that. I'm very much against, if you go to a liberal denomination, you hear somebody, well, I'll give you a great example. Father Newhouse used to love to tell the story. No, he didn't love to tell it, but he told it. He once spoke down at the headquarters of the National Council of Churches. No, he spoke at the Union Seminary across from the National Council of Churches, and he was heckled. It was during the late 80s, during Reagan's war with Central America. And finally, at one point, he stopped him. He said, you know what? There is more agreement in this room among all of you about what we ought to be doing in Nicaragua than there is agreement about what the Apostles' Creed means. And if I was to try to get a job at the National Council of Churches, the first question you would ask me is not, what do I think about the Apostles' Creed, but what do I think of Reagan's war? And so they had so politicized the message that they made the political more important than the theological. And I often felt that that was an important point. And sometimes you can see it happen on the right also. We dare never let that happen. So I always want to keep my friendship, despite my own views, with people, because we do see through a glass darkly a lot.
Question. Kylie?
It seems like within our generation there's some sort of push that just defines people as liberal or conservative is oversimplifying the matter. You know, you talk to people who are the third way idea of like, oh, let's all come together, but then you also talk to people who are like, I refuse to be defined,
Yeah.
you know, which, you know, when you think about education, social policy, foreign policy, there's a lot of issues within that. So is it possible to hold, you know, I mean, is it possible to hold differing ideas across different issues? And if so, within a faith context, can people have lively discussions about those things without defining themselves as liberal and conservative?
It's pretty tough in this day and age of soundbite television yak shows where people are screaming across, and you got to say, I'm on whose side you're on. But let me say that it should be that people find us a little unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be that we're not just cookie cutters.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I also want to say, which I was hinting at earlier, I have some friends who don't want to ever be labeled. And I would say, you know, are you spineless? I mean, you really do have convictions and you're hiding them. I mean, at the end of the day, I want somebody says to me, you know, well, you sound like a conservative. I said, first of all, it's not the most important thing in my life. Okay, there are other things. But I am a conservative, and it's an inference from those other things. And let me tell you why. I have a certain view of government and its limits. I have a certain view of what the welfare state did and how bad it made things. I used to be a big Great Society liberal, and I see that it destroyed many homes and families in this country. My mother was state vice chairman of the Democratic Party in North Carolina when I was growing up. I grew up in a Democratic household. Before my mother died, I told her, Mom, I said, I became a liberal. I became a conservative for liberal reasons. And she stopped and thought about it. I said, let me say it again. I became a conservative for liberal reasons. I think all the things that you worked so hard for in the 60s, many of them right and just, have been so bad for certain communities in America, where it's encouraged male irresponsibility and destroyed families and encouraged the breakup of homes. That's not liberality to encourage those kind of bad habits in people. So that makes me become a conservative. On the life questions, I'm a conservative. On the government's misuse of money, you know, I think we've spent too much. And so at the end of the day, you finally have to say, this is why I end up here. Now, look, let me say, you know, for instance, the Iraq War. There are really smart conservatives who disagree with the fact that we went to Iraq. William F. Buckley was that way. George Will was that way. And there's some really smart liberals who think we should have done what we did, and they still are defending it. So that's one where you can't easily pigeonhole. There are libertarians who think we had nothing to do in the Middle East, and there are liberals at the New Republic that said we were right to go there. So some of these things become unpredictable. But these are prudential matters among honest people looking at tough data and saying, this is what we need to do now. So I think in this, but I'd like for us, whatever we do and whatever positions are, that our disposition be kind and loving and generous and decent and magnanimous. Why? Because we are broken, fallen creatures ourselves, and but for the grace of God, we too can be wrong on these issues. So we need to have a public posture that is less harsh and less judgmental and less self-righteous when we explain our positions, if you know what I mean. We really need to do it because we know, but for the grace of God, you know, our lives would not have been changed. So we really have to work on our public, the way we present ourselves publicly, that we don't, I sometimes feel like in many parts of American fundamentalism, do they really understand the gospel? That it really is about grace. And oftentimes you get harsh, bitter, angry, legalistic tones that doesn't make the gospel sound appealing at all. And that's not why we came into the kingdom, because some harsh, legalistic, angry person scared us in. It's because somebody was patient with us for a long time and explained it to us in such a way we couldn't help but listen.
And particularly because God was patient with us for a long time.
And God was patient with us for a very long time and still is.
Well,
So that's a long answer. That's a long answer to your point. I know what you're trying to say. Let me just say, our public posture should be one where every now and then people say, wow, I didn't know he thought that, or she thought this. I was really pleased once when my friend who I've done many things with, and I disagree with almost everything politically, E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post, once told me that he got me on a liberal radio show and he described to the woman who was going to interview me, Michael is a conservative, but with a moderate disposition. So you'll like him. A conservative with a moderate disposition, whatever that is. Or as one historian, I never told you this, Marvin, Alan Gelso, when I first met him, he's a historian on Lincoln, said to me, he said, you know, you have the body language of a liberal and the mind of a conservative. I didn't ask what is the body language of a liberal, but I think I got the point. But does that make sense?
Yeah.
by the way, there are some copies of the new issue of World that I brought down and put it on the table over there. And yeah, I mean, we try to do that occasionally.
Oh, I know you do.
On immigration, for example, we really differ from what has become, sadly, the standard conservative position, and some other things too. I'll tell you, I'm right now, and if any of you have any thoughts on this, I am kind of rethinking drug policy questions, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts on where we should go.
Well, be sure to go back through Commentary Magazine and pull up James Q. Wilson's argument against drug legalization.
Okay. we'll
Because
do
when
that.
someone says they're rethinking drug policy, it
Rethinking
means
drug policy.
he's moving to a libertarian direction. Before you go there,
Don't wanna go there.
read James Q. Wilson's 10 points about why drugs should not be legal, and then get back to me.
I'll do that. Other questions? Yeah, Brian?
This kind of goes back to what David had asked about the church actually having a public posture, and the difficulty of having a face and a voice for evangelicalism, or even for the gospel. I just wonder what the merit is of seeing that what the church has been saying for a long time is true. The gospel creates a different kind of community. And Chesterton talks about this a lot. There is a church, you can critique it. It's really been pretty infallible. It's done what it's supposed to do because it's a community formed by the gospel. It's been saying things fairly accurately about the world and how things should be. And even Lewis kind of picks up on this idea and says we should aim at heaven and we'll get the earth thrown in. We should aim at creating a better society by looking at the kingdom of heaven. And we'll see that the kingdom of God just gets better, the kingdom of man gets better. What are the merits of seeing that there's a problem with abortion? There's a problem with 79% of Americans think that it's fine that Michael Phelps, was smoking a bong, and was, caught doing that in front of America, and what that says to children. And is there a merit to saying that the kind of community that the gospel creates is a community that lives better, and living better looks like protecting life. Living better looks like, caring for your fellow man in a way that could even be politically sound. I'm not asking if there's political orthodoxy immediately recognized by speaking the words of the gospel into existence, but what are the merits of people like us envisioning a better world, seeing that the gospel creates a different kind of community, and working to connect the dots for society to listen to so that we can have an actual coherent public posture. Because now it seems a little scattered. It seems like we've got a hodgepodge of, Michael Gerson, I think, has some thoughtful comments to make on, maybe we should take a little bit of Catholic social thought. George Weigel, he's a colleague of yours at EPBC. Brilliant stuff. Is there something better to recognize and realize with our public posture that isn't there right now?
Yeah, there's a lot to do. And there is a lot to be said. But before we despair too quickly, again, we don't know the end of history and we don't know God's ways. And our job is to do our duty, to be faithful in our calling, to work away in our place where God has put us, and let God is the one who understands redemptive history far better than we do, and we've not been let in on between now and then what's going to happen, but we do know that there is an end. I like what Lewis says that about the second coming. The issue is not knowing the day or the hour. The issue is whether we were at our posts when the inspection comes, doing our duty. And I work with George and I knew Father Newhouse, and I have great respect for Catholic moral teaching and Catholic social thought. There's some struggles in the Catholic Church too, you might have heard. And so that's not going to solve everything. And all I'm trying to say is, I guess my view of the church right now is the gospel, because the church, both in the Protestant part that I'm in and in the Catholic part, some of my best friends are in, we've all got our challenges in the church. I've just been a member of the Episcopal Church; it's now become Anglican, and I just keep looking around at the disarray of Protestantism, and I go, the church? And then I look around at some of the disarray of Catholicism, the church, and you know what I do? I cling to the gospel. And I just say, the gospel transcends the church that I'm a part of and the church that my Catholic friends are a part of. That being said, that I think we ought to borrow and grab everything we can from Catholic social thought and Catholic moral teachings, but we do need to know that in the theology department at Notre Dame, there's a lot of argument about what Pope Benedict does and does not mean. And most of the time they don't agree with him, or Pope John Paul II. I'm just saying that to not to throw any water on that, but to say that we ought to grab the best parts we can from the classical traditions and from contemporary writers, and then go do our work and raise our families and do our jobs, and pray that in the midst of all of our fumbling around, God will bless it, honor it, and bring people into His kingdom, and that the world might be a little more just and a little more sane.
Has any big enough organization or group of people grabbed the best of all those things?
Oh yeah,
Put them
Ethics
in
and
one
Public
place?
Policy Center. Our website is eppc.org.
And the King's College.
And the King's
And how
College.
can we make that so big you can't? You have to listen to it. That's what I would love to see. Someone who has thoughtfully said, "I love the gospel. I burn with passion for it." It creates a different kind of community and some better thoughts about how the society can be run, and then talks about that, dialogues thoughtfully about it, disagrees a little bit. There's color and flair and humanity, but still some hard truth. And then, the media, people that are asking questions, people that want to help envision a better world by reading literature from think tanks, then consult that place, because this is a career.
Let me say, I gave something a little bit, I didn't mean to sound as pessimistic as I did. Now I want to sound very, really optimistic, and that is this. I can tell you personal stories and testimony of people who have been drawn into the kingdom because, not of something they read, but because of the community at which they visited, and the places they moved, and they saw the koinonia among Christians, and it drew them into the kingdom. Right now, the fastest growing religion in the world is Protestant Pentecostalism in Asia and across the world. And Philip Jenkins has documented, despite the fast growth of Islam, it's being in fact, his view is that radical Islam some of it is a fruit of the growth of Pentecostalism and of the spread of Christianity around the globe. Some of that spread is rooted in good preachers, but also just in people's lives that are desperately lonely, finding community in churches, whether they're Catholic or Protestant or Pentecostal. And so I don't want to sound too, the church is growing, and it's booming in other parts of the world. And Africans are now sending missionaries to us. So it's Christianity is booming in Africa right now. Christians are being persecuted in these countries because of their growth. They're scaring thugs all around the world because of their growth. They are thugs, that's what the word is. Well, thug. We've met some thugs in this commission, and they're not pleasant people. But all that to say that there's a mystery to the gospel and a mystery to God's ways. And I only get encouragement from saying we all need to be faithful and where we are, and encouraging others to read thinkers that we respect and like. And we have very short time here. We really do. I'm more and more struck these days, now that I've been in Washington for a third of a century. It's ignorance. But, I'm in my 50s, and I've lost a lot of friends in the last 2 or 3 years in my age group. And I'm reminded, you and I both knew Diane Nippers and Dr. David Larson, a medical doctor, and David Coolidge. And I've been to a lot of funerals, and I realize we're not all here. We're not promised a whole lot of time. So I think in that amount of time, we've got to do our duty faithfully where we are, and be grateful that God is the God of redemptive history and has this stuff in control. That's where I find comfort. One of the things that Father Newhouse taught me, I heard him say 20 years ago, that every day he read the obituaries. Every day. He said, Michael, somebody famous dies every day. You can find it in the obituary page. And but the other thing he said was that what's important about reading the obituaries is it keeps your feet on terra firma. When you go in there and you read that people that younger you are have died for whatever reason. So I have the habit of going to the Washington Post Metro page and looking at that, and one of my favorite rock and roll singers has died. Some famous writer has died. But you also go through and see the ages of people, and you realize they're younger than I am. I'm not trying to be morbid. I'm only trying to remind us we aren't here a long time, and we need to be faithful where we are.
Yeah, and one of the great things about Newhouse is that while he certainly had that contemplation
Yes.
that understanding is.
But he was vigorously involved.
Vigorously involved in it. And this is such an interesting combination. Increased Mather used to say, "Man knows not his time." And Newhouse was saying that.
By the way, did you see his last several paragraphs in the last issue of First Things?
Yeah.
I really enjoy, where he's saying, "It looks like I'm not well," and he's basically saying goodbye. In the last page of the most recent issue of First Things, in the public square, he's got like 3 paragraphs reflecting on his potential imminent demise. You get chills reading it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, this is a remarkable combination, that he had that
Yes.
sense of mortality, but at the same time tirelessly going on. I mean, the one time that I, in a sense, was asking him for counsel, this is towards the late 90s, and I had been going around speaking about compassionate conservatism and going here to this city, this city, this city, piling up frequent flyer miles, which you get when you never see your family and stuff like that. And, we were just talking, and I suppose I was in a complaining mood, saying, gee, I have to go here and here and here. And so he told me that what his mentor read
It is. And I said, well, I just need you to photocopy a few things right now. And you want to change the world. And I've asked a couple of historians who are experts on Wilberforce, was Wilberforce aware of his significance when he was Wilberforce? And they both said absolutely not. That he was being faithful to his calling. He didn't know 100 years later we'd be doing a movie about him that we'd all flock to see. Grace. And I take some comfort in that, because in the Wilberforcian revival, many kids come to Washington and say, I'm here to be the next Wilberforce. And I just want to say, well, what are your gifts? And let's do that first. And God will determine where you're the next Wilberforce. Now, as to my calling, it's funny. I majored in psychology. I have no idea why I'm where I am. I have no idea. I mean, I didn't plan any of this. And I take some comfort in that, in the sense that I really did. I worked, when I was in college, I worked at 3 different psychiatric hospitals with people that were really mentally suffering. And I thought I was going to be a counselor or a clinical psychologist. And through various steps that I could tell you, it would take some time, I ended up in Washington, and I ended up go work with Chuck Colson. He needs a research assistant, traveling around the country, going to prisons, getting involved in politics. And nothing that I studied prepared me for that, except general interest and being self-taught. And I get a lot of resumes of people. I've been to law school. I have a PhD in ethics from Chicago. And I look and I tell my wife, this person should be in my position. Far more qualified. So for me, it's a blessing and a mystery to me that I've somehow been put in a place where I spend my time with a lot of. I was sitting like where Dr. Olasky is, next to the 3rd most powerful person in the Chinese government when I was chair of the commission in China. And he kept going on about agricultural policies in China. I said, sir, I think you misunderstood us. We're not that group. We're the Religious Liberty Commission. He'd been briefed improperly. There I was pressing this 3rd most powerful person in China. And the chairs were a little bit bigger than this. I was sitting up, and my other commissioners were down the row, and it's this huge Chinese building. I looked around and I thought, what am I doing here? I didn't map this out when I was a conscious objector, or I was at Covenant College, or when I became a Christian at Frontier Ranch in Young Life. Here I am telling this guy, no, you're changing the topic, sir. And at meetings in China, we finally said, the other commissioner said, Mr. Chair, you should feel free. Interrupt these guys, because they stonewall. Sir, I was interrupting Chinese leaders, Sir, thank you for that long-winded introduction, but we do want to ask you about prisoner X and prisoner Y while we're here, and I know we only have 15 more minutes. So we did that. But all that to tell you that I think our lives, all of our lives, are full of surprises, and where we're doing things. I think we should in a disciplined fashion, map out what our gifts are and work hard to study and to go in a certain direction. So if you're going to be a medical doctor, you really need to study medicine. If you're going to be a lawyer, you need to go to law school. But I think there's a lot of surprises in our lives, and I've certainly had a lot of them. I wouldn't have ever predicted, when I was a student at Covenant, that I would be meeting with world leaders and also leading journalists in Washington talking about how to understand evangelical Christianity. I had a reporter from Newsweek call me up 2 years ago when Senator David Vitter got in trouble from Louisiana if you remember the Bitter case. And she wrote a piece called The Bitter Effect, and she interviewed me. And I don't know Senator Bitter, and I just know his reputation. And he'd gotten some trouble, some moral indiscretions, and she wanted to know what do evangelicals do when they hear this news that a Christian senator is messed up. And you can find it on Newsweek. But, I said, well, first of all, we're not surprised. She said, you're not surprised? I said, oh, no. I said, I'm surprised by virtue, not by vice. She said, that's a pretty negative view of human nature. I said, well, it's my view of human nature. I'm surprised when people do the right thing. And then I said something about the gospel and about grace and about God being forgiving and about the prodigal son. And she said, wow, no wonder evangelical churches are growing so fast. That's quite a good message. And I said, well, that's why it's called the good news. And this is all in the Newsweek piece. I said, that's why it's called good news. It's not bad news. It's really good news. Anyway, I tell you that to say I had some wonderful opportunities, and I'm glad to be there. But I have to say that God, at the end of the day, maps out our lives and puts us in places that I think we're all going to be surprised by. That's a long-winded answer. But it gave me a chance to tell a few anecdotes. Thank you.
I find your perspective is very refreshing. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
I am in a public policy class. You may have heard of Dr. David Tubbs, who teaches here. One of the questions I asked him just last week had to do with Christians in politics. Because to me, it's sometimes easy to look at all the tensions and all the problems in politics and say, well, that's just messy, that's just, like you said, gray, like, why should Christians be in that? And then I pull back and I say, well, of course Christians should be in that because it's messy and it needs, so that's more the side that I've fallen on. But I wonder, how did you deal with the tensions of politics, and what would you recommend for people considering going into politics?
Well, it takes me back to my earlier comments that had not anticipated this question, but it takes me back to my earlier comments about our view of reality and about theology. It's a theological. I mean, the people that came to Washington that were most overly excited about Ronald Reagan's election were conservative Christians who were misinformed theologically because they overinflated what they thought he was going to bring. And so I have to repeat again St. Augustine. Because we live in a fallen world, we live in ambiguous times. Doesn't mean we can't make decisions, doesn't mean they're not hard moral choices, but there is going to be a level of ambiguity and there's going to be a level of messiness. But no great social movement, whether it was Wilberforce's, where he had to withstand the ridicule of his friends, economic pressures, and totally ostracized, or Dr. King getting beat over the head and bloodied for almost a dozen years before anything got done. Messy, real messy, physically messy for people. No doubt they had long night meetings. Why are we doing this? Why are we here? We could get shot. Well, it's messy, Dr. King. Yeah, it's real messy. It's life-threatening. And Christians right now around the world, their lives are on the line because of their basic commitment to the gospel. The answer to the problem of messiness is that, welcome to the real world. It's all messy. And it's learning to work through the messiness and to be hopeful. Again, another Newhousian point, if I may. To be hopeful. Not optimistic, but hopeful because of the hope that we know we have. And that in the midst of, even during political elections that disappoint, you can still be hopeful and still be faithful. Say, this will come back around. We're going to keep at it. We'll keep pressing. That is what keeps us from despairing ever. And to plod along. Look, being on this commission has not just been all fun. There's a lot of bureaucratic stuff and a lot of press releases that go ignored. But you plod along and you just do it and you keep saying things and you find out that somebody was pushed or a congressman was pushed to raise these issues. So you see signs of light here and there. And you keep pressing on. So again, it's being faithful even in the midst of the message. We should never be surprised by the messiness. That's my point.
how have you personally dealt with kind of maybe internal conflicts or?
No, I get that. How I've done it personally is the theological conviction that this is explained theologically, that I should never either be overly despairing or overly optimistic about, I was glad when Bush v. Gore was handed down and that President Bush won. By the way, I'm still glad that he won and will defend it to the end and think that history will, in fact, not only prove him right on so many of these issues, but will prove him right sooner rather than later. In fact, I have some historian friends I have deep respect for who say Bush recovery is already underway. Naomi Emory says that. Wilfred McClay says that. Anyway, I'm getting off track. My point is...
The Bush recovery reputation, you're saying?
Yes, the recovery of his reputation. That's my point. I'm willing to say that on the internet. It's not a popular thing to say in Washington, though. But let me just say that the way you deal with it internally is with a prior theological understanding of not having over expectations and not having too low of expectations. We live between the ages. We live between the ages. We're going to see victories and major disappointments. And then we're going to see victories again, and we're going to see major disappointments. But we press along, encouraged by the brethren in the community that will hold us up. We can't do this alone. We need fellowship. We need community. We need koinonia. And we need brothers and sisters to remind us when we're overinflating somebody's victory or deflating somebody else's victory or getting too down. This is not our home. If I may use the word, we are sojourners here. We live, the world is not our home. We have a future city, and that's what keeps us hopeful. Does that make sense? We're starting to preach, and we're almost done.
You talk about the importance of friendships with people with whom you disagree. How does that work in issues where people are very heavily invested at a personal level in homosexual marriage? I don't know, I suppose, if somebody is totally a homosexual marriage, can they be friends with a gay person who is glad to be married?
Yeah, well, I have some friends, such friends, and one of them just sent me an editorial 2 weeks ago. I can't use his name, but and I can say this, it's not Andrew Sullivan, but it's another very bright homosexual man who's in a relationship who sent me an editorial that he wrote and said, would you co-write this with me? I think we can put it in the Washington Post or New York Times, where he was making a case for civil unions and asking for the left to back off and allow us to have religious freedom to disagree with it and not be punished by the state. It was a pretty nice but at the end of the day I said, I'll just say, Jonathan, I can't do that. I'm still not there with you, but I'll be glad to help you if I could. But we have a real friendship, and he's a brilliant man. Let me tell you, I have a close friendship. Not close. I have a friendship with Christopher Hitchens, who I've gotten to know through some programs I do with the press, and I've moderated 2 debates like Professor Olasky has. One at Georgetown University with Alistair McGrath and Christopher Hitchens, and one at Stanford with Jay Rick and Christopher Hitchens. And Christopher and I are friends, and we don't agree on anything religiously, obviously. We have conversations. And by the way, I thought Marvin at the University of Texas was terrific, because you were so right. Which he never answered. It doesn't poison everything. In fact, it doesn't more than that. He never answered that. But my point is, again, but for the grace of God, our views or our lives would be similar to these people that we're talking about. And might I just say on this issue of sexuality, we're all broken people sexually. All of us. Everybody. Hetero, homo, both. There's just no place for heteros to be self-righteous on these questions. Because we got so much problems in our own community. And we got marriages that are messing up, and we've got our own struggles and temptations that, having said that, doesn't mean we change our views on these questions. But it sure does affect the way we approach people. because we don't know what everybody's dealing with at any time. And I'm saying that to just simply underline the fact that but for the grace of God and the gospel, we wouldn't be people full of joy because of the hope that we have within us. Does that answer part of it? You should have those friendships. But could I just say this? Friendships should be built on integrity, though. They're not friendships to say, I will relinquish all my convictions so I can be your friend. And you see people do this. You know, they get weak-kneed. They want to be somebody's friend. No, this is what I believe. This is what I feel. This is my experience. This is my narrative. This is my story. And we can still be friends, right? By the way, when you treat people like that with respect and dignity, they know it. Because they've been beaten up a lot. And they know it when they know where you're coming from and you don't treat them that way, they're kind of surprised. So one of the best parts of my job is I get to go around and disarm people. I love disarming people. People have caricatures of what we're like. And disarming people is a fun thing. Does that make sense? There's another one back there. I know we're running out of time, but I got time.
Okay, David?
Quick question. You mentioned earlier that you suggest we read some political liberals with whom we disagree, some serious political liberals. Who are some of those today you would suggest we read?
Well, I think that if you read the New Republic magazine, which is a weekly, there are people there. I think Fareed Zakaria, who writes in Newsweek, is kind of a moderate, but a very serious thinker. By the way, there's some that I don't read. I mean, I just think their arguments are not serious. But what you can do is, of course, with the internet, there's all kinds of options. But what I find is that we want to avoid what one conservative writer says. We want to avoid people who want to avoid becoming people who live in a hive, in a beehive. And all we do is buzz around fellow bees and talk to each other. And I think the most interesting people are people who are not in the hive, but they have convictions in that hive, but they move outside of it. And I'm just surprised at the amount of liberals I meet who don't read any conservative intellectuals. They don't read them. They don't know. And you say, well, you haven't read Buckley, you haven't read Kirk, you haven't read Hayek, you haven't read these people? Well, how do you know what you're critiquing? And then you find conservatives who've read nothing but one line of the argument. And I just think it's better, I think we can have self-confidence in our own convictions, that we don't have to be intimidated by other viewpoints. And so there are places to start. I would say that the New Republic would be one. And I'm sure I'll think of other writers as we go through.
Yeah, I'd agree with that recommendation in the New Republic. And let me flip the question. Evangelical intellectuals, who should students read? Because we often hear about Catholic intellectuals and so forth, not so much about evangelicals.
I was afraid you were going to ask that. Well, in what area, Marvin? Is it politics, philosophy?
You're saying there are so many that unless we specify an area, there may not be all that many that you want to cite. So,
well, this is a public policy discussion, right? So, I'm just sitting as you're asking a question, thinking how much I've learned from reading First Things, and the thinkers in there, including Father Newhouse, but some others who've appeared in there over time. Look, I must quickly say, I've benefited greatly from reading The Tragedy of American Compassion. I'm not saying that just for the camera or for you, but it's true. And I always read Marvin's editorials in the World, always, even when I don't agree with them, which actually has become less and less the case. That's probably growth on my part or your part, or both of us. There are people who I could think of in Books and Culture and in First Things and other think journals, in the Weekly Standard and the National Review, that I like to read regularly and always benefit from. Victor David Hansen, you see a National Review Online. Mark Stein, my friend David Brooks, I agree with a lot, but not always. And I like to take some of these people and when they agree on almost everything but don't agree on something, I like to see the different takes. For instance, during the run-up of the Sarah Palin controversy, I thought it was very interesting to read Victor David Hanson and Mark Stein on National Review Online, who were very strongly defending Governor Palin, and to read David Brooks and other conservatives who were disappointed in her candidacy. And I thought it was interesting, people who really kind of agree in political philosophies had a different take on how to review the candidacy of Governor Palin. I thought that was a great exercise, and I think the jury's still out on that, on her candidacy, by the way.
Let me just
sorry,
ask
I'm
one
getting-
let me just ask
I'm
one
getting
other question
off
then. I mean, who do you think, students who are interested in politics and public policy, who should they be looking at as far as the future leaders of evangelical politics, let's say? As I'm not talking about the groups, I'm talking about the people who are actually in politics and running for office, in office.
Oh, who are some of the leaders now in
Yeah,
Washington?
who are some of the leaders now, and who are the rising leaders?
Well, I still haven't finished that issue of World that I have in my briefcase that talks about the rising leaders of evangelical politicos, but I intend to read it tomorrow. Let me put it this way. Things are pretty devastated right now for the Republican Party, but it won't take long for any of us to find out who some of the really thoughtful young leaders are going to be by the way they comport themselves in the next few months and in the next few years.
Yeah.
And I think the jury's still out on who some of those people are going to be, and it's too early to tell who they might be. Some of the ones we thought earlier that were going to be such faded, and others stuck. But let me just sort of end on this point, though. It's not so urgent that we just keep asking who are some of the evangelical leaders going to be. I could open up a whole discussion now on natural law and common grace and say to you that I never miss a column written by Charles Krauthammer. Never in the Washington Post do I miss a column by Charles Krauthammer, who is a very serious Jew but not a Christian. And I want to say on the basis of common grace, the Reformed doctrine of common grace, that when it comes to looking at public life, you don't just have to be a Christian to get it right.
Agreed.
We agree on that.
Yeah.
But I remember years ago when some people in Reform circles said they wouldn't read everything had to be distinctively Christian, and then they would quote Hayek and von Mises. This is Gary North. You know, don't read anything from a non-believer, but let me quote Hayek and von Mises to you. I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. As our friend, the late Ron Nash, said, Marvin, once, he said he didn't believe there was Christian economics. He said there's good economics and bad economics. I'm for good economics. Christians can get economics right and they can get it wrong. I say this in front of an economics professor, but I think I probably have some agreement there. Now, there are Christian principles that would bring the whole economic process that ought to be looked at and not avoided and held to. That's all true. But there's sometimes, because of common grace, that non-believers can get that right, and sometimes even better than we do.
Okay, well.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and we're just.
I don't want to end on a heretical note. I hope you're teaching
No,
me.
you have to end on the note of telling us about what it was like to be a mascot of the Philadelphia 76ers.
Well, what it was like, it was back during the days of Dr. Julius Erving, and a friend of mine, when I was in graduate school at American University, and the humorous part was that I worked for Charles Colson's ministry, as I told you, and I met through Chuck Colson's ministry Pat Williams, who was the general manager of Philadelphia 76ers, and this company in New York City that made what's the Saturday morning program, the Muppets? No, not the Muppets.
Smurfs? No.
The Saturday.
Animaniacs?
Sesame Street?
That was it.
Sesame Street?
Yeah, Sesame Street. The people who made those costumes had approached the 76ers. They had the 76ers approached them and said, "You want to make a mascot?" And then they said, "Well, you got to find somebody that's extroverted and outgoing but knows the game of basketball." Pat said, "Well, we know that person." And so I literally came up to New York City and interviewed. And they said to me, "Well, you might be funny in person, but when you wear a costume, you don't talk. Can you move your body around and stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." And I passed the interview, and I was in grad school at American University, and I was at all the home games of the 76ers, and I looked through the coursework for graduate school, and I realized that out of a class of 14 classes, I was going to miss 6 because of the games. So I went to the professor and I said, "Can I have your permission to miss classes? I have a part-time job." in the evenings on these dates. And he said, what are you doing? And so I told him, he said, that's a great excuse. We'll be sure to get you the notes. So I did it, and it went okay. I just danced around the music during timeouts and half times.